Hey, Darlene, thank you for coming in. You just have such a marvelous background. I mean, in the co-founding of the world's first impact technology companies in aerospace and drone transport, all of your wonderful work with Singularity University, working across ag tech and food tech and ed tech and climate and government and health tech and more. In fact, we're both on the advisory council of the Innovation Accelerator for the World Food Program, which is a marvelous program. But you've had these marvelous roles with Singularity, Ashoka, the World Bank, and nonprofits in Vietnam and Myanmar, and you've been speaking and really influencing the United Nations, the World Food Program. You've been at South by Southwest, a really famous Texas-based, Austin-based conference. You've done things with Google, Salesforce, Intuit, I mean, Walmart, Sony, Aramco, TEDx, you name it. You've been featured in all of the major publications that are out there. You name it, you've been part of those publications. You got a really interesting educational background as well, very diverse, sort of illustrating combinatorial thinking. You've also served in the government kind of policy area, for example, in the Biden administration, cross-border trade, and you hold patents as well. So and it goes on and on. Just a wonderful career of contribution. So thank you for coming in and sharing the insights with my audience.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. We've been in touch for many years as part of the World Food Program, but haven't had a chance to really sit down and talk.
So, Darlene, because you've got this marvelous career, really continued contribution, what are the three inflection points that made this wonderful contributor you are today and continuing? And I want to go really early. It could have been when you were 3 or 5 years old. It could have been inside, outside the family. It could have been challenges that happened in your early life. It could have been mentors. Could have been in school or outside of school. What are those three inflection points that really shaped you and where you are?
Yeah, I think actually it does start really early. When I was young, my parents moved to a very tiny town, 2,000 people, mostly cows, very rural. Um, so I was like 3 or 4 years old, and there were two interesting experiences. One is I grew up in a very small community where I sort of had the chance to really care about other people and also see how different parts of life and life experiences impact people, which got me really interested in how do you solve social problems. And then at that same time, just by chance, when I was very young, there was this 90-year-old man who lived next door to me. And it turns out he was the assistant to Dr. Robert Goddard and Esther Goddard, who built before, launched the space age. And he told me about he would go out into the fields, the farm fields with them and test the rockets. And Esther sewed the parachutes. And well, even before anyone said this is a job or this is what you should do with your life, I had that story. And so I think that really shaped my thinking that you can live an adventurous life, you can make a huge impact. Yeah.
So that's really fascinating. So the move to a rural area helped shape you as well, and then having exposure to this really transformational thinker or the thinking community, people who don't think in terms of boundaries, but what is the possible, right? Because they're unbounded thinking in essence, right? And a really good example, what I call combinatorial thinking. So in your early years in school, then were you like, let's say when you were in grade school and then in high school, were you interested in a diverse range of topic areas or more science oriented, or what were the things that caught your interest?
Yeah. So my school in this small town was very small. Um, I think my graduating class, it had less than 50 kids. It was a public school. We were drawing from other places where kids were driving 30 minutes to get there. And the school exposed us to a lot of ideas, but it wasn't like a super strong academic place. But we had caring teachers and um, also just saw a lot of like we had real life experiences, right? Where I saw people around me struggle, but then solve the problems around them too. We had a lot of small businesses, restaurants, very practical things. So I think it was a combination of being intellectually interested in things personally, but also seeing people around me make things work day to day. So yeah.
I see. So really being surrounded in a community that's small, but you can see life's challenges and opportunities and things like that. And that would be anchored in things like integrity and hard work, I'm sure, and community, and that would shape sort of your views on life. And but you end up in Stanford, and that's to get your undergraduate degree. And Stanford's a pretty good school. So um, what shaped you to go to Stanford, and what did you study at Stanford?
Yeah, yeah. So after I got into Stanford, I met the one of the admission counselors, and he said he actually drove down to my hometown because they never had a student from there before. So it wasn't common, but I think I was like when I was really young, I was interested in big questions. So I wanted to know like what is outer space? What is our universe? What is the limit to that? And at the same time, I had questions about like, why do some people have to suffer in life? Why is life unfair? And so it was these sort of big questions that drove me. And we had a used bookstore, we had a library. So I would ride my bike to those places to learn. I wrote letters to people all over the world. I had a pen pal in Hong Kong. I wrote to some scientists on an island in the Pacific. So I sort of had to like find ways to connect to the world outside my world. This was before the internet existed, but I guess also the benefit of being in a very small town is no one necessarily tells you what you can't do because they don't know. There isn't like a lot of knowledge about the limits out there. I mean, there are challenges too, right? But I basically felt like just keep trying, and something will happen.
So in at Stanford, then did your studies reflect your broad interest and your curiosity and the empathy you have? Like, what were the kind of the favorite subjects that you really gravitated towards?
Yeah, yeah. So when I got to Stanford, I found I was way behind on my academics compared to many of my peers, but I also many of my peers felt they had a lot of pressure on them to go into one very specific career, be a doctor, be a lawyer. And I didn't have that pressure on me. And so even though I was behind, I spent a lot of time exploring. Um, I actually went in as a physics major and came out as a history major. And the overlap was I was like, physics, you're studying sort of how the laws of physics, right? How do different things interact with each other? And then history is like, how do people, institutions, and societies interact? But looking backwards with somebody kind of bringing their own worldview to it versus running like testing it really in reality. So there was some overlap, but I just took actually so many classes in different biology, all over the place that I feel like while I graduated in history, it was much broader.
Yeah, but you also had the science background as well, right? So, very rigorous and kind of foundation-based, math-based. Physics would be very math-based, and then as history having a much broader perspective of really the entire world and all of the ecosystems and how they interact and what's the interplay. History would get into that. And then you get your master's from Johns Hopkins and advanced international studies, and that kind of ties into your curiosity, your global curiosity, and your was a fellow with the Japan U.S. Community Education Exchange, again, really showing your curiosity about other societies and things like that, and how things work together and came together. and then you got into entrepreneurship. So can you describe that story of how you got into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, yeah. So, my mother was a potter and she did spend her life selling her pottery. So like I helped her with her business. It was a small business throughout my entire childhood and life, whether it was writing the price tags or going to art shows to sell her stuff. So that was one influence. But I think I got really interested in the idea of entrepreneurship in when I was in grad school in Washington, D.C., and learned about a place called Ashoka. And yeah, and they're a nonprofit. They've been around for decades. And their definition of entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, was changing a system. So solving like the root cause of a social problem and then changing that on a global scale, how it works. So you have business entrepreneurs, right? That are ideally they're solving a problem that matters and then making money from solving that problem. And the social entrepreneur side, you're also solving a problem that matters and you're reinvesting any money back into the problem, right? So it was that like I then went on to work with Ashoka for nearly a decade and learned how do you actually change systems? How do you think at that big scale? And so that was at the entry point.
And then you've involved in the founding of these companies like DIY Rockets and Matternet. How did that come about?
Yeah. So when I was working at Ashoka, I noticed that people were starting to use technology to do things like fundraise, which is a major problem in the social impact sector. It was like people were using text message to raise a lot of money at the first time. And then, so I was interested in the application of text to nonprofits, but I also had this secret, like, desire in me to understand, aerospace technology that went back to my childhood, right? And I saw that there was this place called Singularity University that had just formed at NASA Ames in California. And I thought I need to go to that program. And so I applied to go to the program. I got rejected and put on the wait list. And then 2 days before the program started, they called and said, "Hey, can you come here for 3 months and join our program?" And that to me was a huge risk. I'd never done, moved across the country in 2 days' notice. I talked to Ashoka and had to work something out with them, but I got on a plane and came to Singularity University. And then I thought I was going to be learning about it was an academic program. And then I got there and said, actually, we want you to start a company. And this company, it has to use an exponential technology. So a technology that's going to scale rapidly while the cost goes down. And we want you to solve a social problem. Okay, so that was it. Oh, and the third piece was it has to impact 1 billion people in 10 years. And we're also going to be locking you up on this old military base with 80 other people, and you won't have, it's going to be really hard to connect with society. So that was a very interesting moment in my life, but I dived into it and learned all that I could. And our classmates in that program, we were all, adults. It was between, 20 years to 60 years. But a group of us came together and formed a company, which has become Matternet, and realized that the drone industry did not exist at that time. You had drones dropping weapons, right? So we launched this company and everyone said it would never work, that it was the worst idea they'd seen. We almost got kicked out of the program, but here we are now with the drone industry. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean that's really fascinating. And you spend a decade at Ashoka, you get really a good idea about impact and scaling from a social impact standpoint. And you have to be entrepreneurial as well, or appreciate the entrepreneurial aspect of that impact space. And then you're made aware of Singularity University, and then you get embedded into Singularity University. And then there's different cohorts working on really transformational, really big problems, one of which is Matternet, right? So, and in Matternet, it's like a real drone delivery systems with Switzerland, with Swissport, and you have your colleagues like Andreas at Ampalo and by rooted in Singularity University. You got this coverage about doing deployments with Swiss hospital lab deployments for urgent medical samples. You get funding from Boeing, Horizon X Ventures, and then, of course, Swiss Ports in there, the Sony Innovation Fund, and Levitate Capital. There's this report then of UPS and Matternet partnership for moving medical samples, Wake Med in North Carolina. And then UPS Flight Forward later received FAA approval for operating a drone delivery airline. And these stories go back to this kind of health care pilot. And then this fully automated drone station in Switzerland and broader urban drone network ambitions. And then you get into the first Silicon Valley home, a drone delivery service in Mountain View. So it's a kind of like an escalating story on a big idea that could impact the world. And at the time, as for a formation, and people, it was still drones. Like, what are they going to do? And now you see them everywhere, right? And it's actually changing everything and how we view the world today. But you're also embedded in some DIY rockets. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So when I was at Singularity University, I was learning about 10 different new technologies all at the same time, right? AI, robotics, advanced manufacturing, all of these different things. And I began to think about like it back in 2011, no one was quite sure if the private space industry was going to exist yet. Everyone still said, it's going to take, 20 years for these rockets to become affordable to move stuff to space. So it was still very unknown on how that would proceed. And I was thinking about how at the time there's a lot of different countries around the world, and there's a lot of people who have talent in aerospace, but they don't have jobs. It could be a country didn't have a space industry, or it could have been workers who worked in the space industry for decades, but we're always kind of held back by the industry. And then at the same time, I was thinking a lot about crowdsourcing. At Ashoka, there was something called Changemakers, which ran online competitions to crowdsource ideas for social impact. And I thought, could you do that with hardware? And I basically designed a challenge. I found a few people to put in a small amounts of money as prizes, and found a technology that existed, but was very, very new, which was 3D printed rocket engines, and put up a contest on the internet for people to design files for 3D printed rocket engines. This was, over 15, it was 10 to 15 years ago, and then found some judges who could judge it. And at the time I was thinking, what if we had a whole company where you had, engineers and different talented people working all around the world building this space company. And that was a vision. But then when I ran the competition, we actually had some good designs and some talented people enter, but they were immediately hired by Boeing and Rocket Lab. And so I realized, like, this is a great tool for innovation. But if I'm going to do it in this open way, all the value is going to go out to other pieces. So it's not a good idea for a company. So that's what I learned from that project.
Yeah, and I can see all of the seeds of the Singularity University and being embedded and a Singularity fellow as faculty chair and vice president of community and impact. And because of that connection, then it gets you into things like agriculture technology, food technology, educational technology, climate tech, government technology, health tech. And because you're in ag tech, food tech, and climate tech, and these kinds of areas, then it's a natural alignment with things like the World Food Program, which is the world's largest kind of humanitarian accelerator of its kind. But they're also interested in climate, and they're interested in health, and they're interested in ag tech as well. So it's a number of different areas. And then, so how did you get connected to Google and Salesforce and people like that?
Yeah, yeah. So I was working on these companies, right? In with Matternet and DIY rockets, and was involved in the first, like with Matternet, the first 3 years of launching it. And then DIY rockets was an experiment. And during that time, I realized like I can do this work, but there's this bigger opportunity even. And that opportunity is help the world, startups, companies, humanitarian organizations better understand technology so they can go on and innovate solutions. And so I thought like there's this, like somebody needs to come and like really push on the development of this new sector or industry. And so then Singularity asked me to come back and work for them. I had been a student, right? And part of their incubator. And then they invited me to come back. And so then I came back and spent the next 10 years helping people understand how to use tech for good or build products or services that do tech for good. And that then led to giving all of these different talks, to working with individual startups. And at one point I realized like, if like everything's basically a computer, right? So you have a computer, you put wheels on it, you get an autonomous car. You put propellers on it, you have a drone, right? You put a rocket engine on it, you have an autonomous rocket shipper, you have a robotic satellite, right? And then, so I started seeing like, just like we had put on our iPhone, we have applications and software. In this hardware world, we're putting on, robot arms and wings and all these different things in the same way. So it's really one industry with different applications. And that can cut across, improving food security, clean water, but it's all being driven by the same sort of forces and trends.
So, the World Food Program is using Google Launchpad, right, for the innovation and the startups that they're working with. So you've been embedded in that in some way, right, or working as part of it?
Yeah. So in Singularity University, I want to say it was 2015, maybe 14 or 16, the World Food Program would come to Singularity University when we were running our startup program, and they would hang out there for like a week, which was amazing for the participants to have that, that level of expertise come. And then the World Food Program and Singularity started building out one of the ideas. I think it was a friend of someone who worked at Singularity who helped them with their first blockchain program, building blocks.
Right. And really famous. Building blocks is famous.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So building blocks allowed them to distribute money so people could access food. They could purchase food anywhere on the blockchain and save them a lot of money and all of that. But then it sort of, I think the World Food Program became this leader in working with frontier technologies. And then many other people were involved too, of course, right? But, yeah.
Yeah, but you're such a perfect fit, right? Because they're very much in the forefront of innovation for humanitarian good, and you're the same. You're at the forefront of innovation for humanitarian good, and you're entrepreneurial. And entrepreneurship brings sustainability, right? So it's sustainable innovation that continues. I can see all of these things being such a perfect fit. So, and of course, you've integrated with the United Nations, and you spoke at Southwest because you're such a marvelous innovator. You've done TEDx talks in Vilnius and in Budapest, etc. You've written pieces for the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Spiceworks, the OECD Forum, the Qatar Foundation, Grit Daily, Authority Magazine. You're really featured as a social impact hero. So all of that work and actually meaningfully execute, but you also decided to author a book. Could you talk about that?
Yes, yes. So I think uh, in a way I played sort of a, I don't know, it's not a background role, but like a couple weeks ago, I met a woman who told me that she had been inspired to launch a startup because a talk I gave ago 10 years ago. And I realized like it matters a lot that somebody's out there just trying to show people like how the world's changing, what is possible, and encouraging people to like step up and lead. So that's like, I think what is really driving me. I want good people in charge of and building the applications of these powerful technologies, thinking about society. That's like what I'm trying to do, right? But I also realized like the when I started my career, like so okay, that's the vision, right? That when I started my career, working in social impact was really difficult if you didn't come from a background with access to money. So the first 10 years of my life, I was working multiple jobs. I was working in a nonprofit somewhere, and then on a weekend I had a side job, right? And I was always, you know, living with different roommates, trying to make all the finances work. And so it wasn't easy. And but then when I started getting into the world of um social impact in tech, I started seeing that startups were using these exponential technologies to solve social problems. And because the costs fall so quickly when you're building technologies, initially it's very expensive, right? But then the costs fall. Even things like the fact that anyone can go online and get access to free AI is crazy when you think about how we thought about this 20 years ago. You'd have to spend millions of dollars and a few people could use it. So when I saw that trend was happening across all of technology, it was like, wow, we can actually afford to solve social problems, and we can afford to build companies that pay people a decent salary. And to me, that's the game changer. Like, you no longer have to choose. Do you live, a life of poverty to do good in the world, or can you have a normal job and change the world? And so the book is really trying to help people understand that you can go into a career where you have if you go into something like electric vehicles, you might be very, very wealthy, right? But you could also, work at a startup for like a satellite company that's predicting natural disasters. You can actually have a real career in the field of social impact. So the book is about why that's happening right now. And then it goes through all of these different fields, food, energy, water, education, giving real examples of companies that are doing that work, and then give some guidance on how to get involved in those jobs. So that's what I wanted people to know. That yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the title is very appropriate, right? Your dream job is here.
Yes.
And the impact technology revolution and the new jobs saving the world. I mean, it's very much encompasses what you're talking about, right? Which is about empowerment and enablement and sort of the proliferation of innovation that anybody can access, right? So
yeah. And also there's a lot of careers. So like we were talking about the World Food Program, and also Google, like I believe one of their innovations was they created a whole new type of using AI for accounting and bookkeeping. So you could be an accountant and work at the intersection of hunger and technology, right? So it's not just you have to be a technologist or a social impact leader. Like there's all these jobs now, marketing, technology, lawyers, sales that are now at the intersection of these jobs that are doing good.
So can you describe what occupies your time right now? So, maybe 3 or 4 sort of priority projects for you currently. So that's kind of the first question. And then we'll get into a little bit more of the future, what you think is interesting. But first of all, what takes your attention right now? The things that really, you're really focusing on right now.
Yeah. So right now I'm doing some different consulting projects for different groups. So one is working on it started out by looking at how air mobility and other technologies were impacting a rural part of California. And now it's turned more into helping them design their fundraising and investment strategy. And then another piece of work is related to wildfire. It's working with a group focused on wildfire resilience here in California in the Bay Area, where that's a big problem. And then I still do some teaching at Singularity University. I might start teaching at another university in the fall. So I'm kind of a little bit scattered. And then there's one project. Right now, it's a volunteer project that I'm doing with LG Nova. So they have an innovation division here in Silicon Valley, and they have an open platform to help people innovate. It's open source. It's nobody's paid, but I'm leading a small project there exploring fusion technology. And so that's something I'm learning about right now. I don't have a background in fusion technology, but when I think about if that technology is ready in the 2030s, it's going to be disrupting fossil fuels, clean energy, geopolitics, right? And so the social impact sector needs to be paying attention, right? And more broadly, I've been thinking about how do the social impact sector, foundations, philanthropists, understand that these cutting edge technologies that won't be here for a decade, because you have to get involved a decade before that to have any influence on them, right? So, yeah.
So, because we're doing this basically, it's like it's live in the sense that, and it's over the internet. So, you broke up when you were describing the name of this open source platform. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So LG, a Korean company, has a division called LG Nova here in Santa Clara, and they have an open innovation council. I'm forgetting the exact title of it, but over the last couple of years, they've been working with the public to innovate. And their leader is saying that historically companies have only innovated in very closed ways. And they want to know what happens if we sort of break down the walls and invite the public in to come innovate with us.
That's really, really fascinating. So LG Nova is the
Yeah.
name of it. Do they have a web presence then and people can sort of apply or reconnoiter?
Yes, anyone can apply. And this is their second year doing it. So you apply, and then the groups form their own sort of teams remotely, come up with their own projects. Then LG starts turning those into different roundtables, presentations. They also have their own group that supports startups. So I'm sure they're watching everything, although that's not the stated intention, right? But yeah.
So that's really interesting. I mean, they should partner or because you're working with them too, partner with IEEE and the entrepreneurship program within IEEE.
Yes.
There's a fairly early one just kind of forming now with the ACM as well and entrepreneurship. And we're the two top science and technology engineering organizations in the world. I'm thinking Microsoft for Startups will be another one too. It's an open platform to maybe partner with on innovation and things like that. I mean, I could think of maybe a dozen others, but maybe that's another conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
We should,
okay, but
when I got connected to them, because through the World Food Program, actually, the advisory council. So you and we have to follow up have another call with them too.
okay, so that's really, really fascinating. Now, let's get into a little bit of futuristic stuff for about 5 minutes, and then we'll close off. So, do you think, so what are the most exciting technologies that you think will really transform the world? So I'm going to name a bunch of them, just kind of
Yeah.
brainstorming, then you talk about the ones that really resonate with you. So So I'm going to list 11 of them. So, and I'm just kind of do this free brainstorming with you, but high performance computing or supercomputing, which is exascale, and you're actually getting zettascale in the cloud, and I could maybe see yotta scale by 2030. You got chip technologies, photonics, you got analog, you got probabilistic thermodynamic chip technologies in there as well, together with standard kind of inference chips and things like that. You have quantum computing, but it's not just quantum computing, it's sensing, signaling. You have advanced materials on new kinds of non-materials, programmable matter. Then we have AI machine learning, of course, which is going through the roof, which could hit AGI. Some people say AGI, we're right in the midst of that. And ASI, superintelligence. And then you have robotics, automation, drones, autonomous vehicles. You have biotechnology, which is, of course, accelerating. You have neurotechnology, brain-computer interfaces, advanced energy and storage, and you already alluded to that already with fusion. And then, but there's a whole green energy space as well. And then advanced manufacturing, space technologies. Now, out of that kind of bucket of 11 technologies, which ones excite you, and can you sort of make some predictions?
Yeah. So of course, my lens is all through how are these going to impact humanity and society and social impact, right? So that's my lens of thinking. And I mean, I want to say, of course, like biotechnology is going to be huge, deserves its own program. I've been thinking a lot about like robots and their introduction into daily life. Humanoid robots, there's a lot of people looking at with these robots that will do your chores for you. And we know very little about what happens when you put a robot into a household. Will kids never learn to do laundry? Or is that liberation, or is that a loss of a crucial skill? So there's a lot of social impact questions, again, that the world should be paying attention to now, not 5 years from now. But something that I think will have a big impact is sort of a convergence of several of these technologies. And we're starting to see it now, but it's forecasting, right? So the more data you have, the more sensors you have, the more computational power you have, you can start predicting things. And so we're seeing, sports betting prediction markets. But then I talked to a woman who works in healthcare, and she says, we now can predict who will have a stroke or heart attack. But the problem is we need a whole new workforce that goes out and does something about that, right? So healthcare prediction is happening. But like the big question I have is, how will prediction impact power? Right? So currently you're most powerful if you have a lot of money or a lot of weapons. But what if you know the future 1 second before everyone else?
Right.
And I think that's going to be it's a new form of power that's emerging in our world that's coming. We see pieces of it, but we're not prepared for that. Right. And so I become really or even thinking about like economic data, predicting inflation. Like, I know the Bay Area's inflation is very different from what's happening a couple states over, right? But we still use one thing. So it's like not only predicting what will happen next, but there's like microcosms of different things. So I think that's going to have a huge impact on our world.
Yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating. And in fact, each one of those topic areas could be like a separate interview, right? Or dialogue. So Darlene, these are the last two questions. And this next question is, what recommendations do you want to leave the audience? And then the one to follow that is, what questions you want to leave the audience? Questions that the audience should be pondering. So first of all, what's your recommendations to the audience?
Yeah. So my recommendation is to think about like what matters most to you in the world, what problems you care about, what do you want to solve in the world, but to not like let your background limit you. So, right, I have a history degree and started in the nonprofit sector. I should not be doing what I'm doing according to convention, right? But I actually learned you can learn so much by just trying something, by just talking to people. And our educational background or our work history should be our powers. They shouldn't be our limits, right? So I want to encourage people, if there's something you're interested in, but you think you're not qualified or capable, don't let that limit you. Just start somewhere, even if it's only reading more about something you're passionate about. And then, like, what questions I have, I guess it's like, what type of world do you really want to live in? Like, and how do we build that world? And we have a lot of different people who are influential or in power or doing different things, but nobody put them there. They decided they were going to go there, right? And so it comes back to all of us. Like, we all have different limits, different strengths, different resources, but I think we all can, like, also step up more, because I really want to make sure that, we're creating the type of world that we want to live in, and that requires all of us to be involved in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really fascinating. You're really asking people to question what's the world going to be like, and then what's their agency and maybe helping shaping the future of a positive world. And so that's on the question side. And then on the recommendation, you're really talking about being actively questioning and curious and running experiments and trying different things and observing different kinds of modalities out there and not being limited to a silo. You're talking about combinatorial thinking, connecting diverse ideas from different communities, forming relationships across diverse communities as well. You're speaking about resilience and agility and adaptability. Optimism, being optimistic about being able to influence and not necessarily having the background, but being curious and reading. Yeah. And then because you indicated, you mentioned reading, it's like when I was talking to Vinod Khosla, where he recommends reading on the edge every day. And so spending time reading in that curiosity of exploring different areas and that, in essence, with the kind of an entrepreneurial mindset is maybe a formula for success. So, Darlene, thank you for coming in and sharing all these wonderful insights with our audience.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for creating this platform so all of us can connect and learn. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.